So photographing birds in flight, to me at least, seems like one of those skills that should be impossible. Then again, I only know how to use a camera on the auto settings. So today, what we thought we would talk through is 5 of Dustin's in-flight photos. Okay, so I thought we could start by understanding the story behind this photo that we've pulled up on the screen. So to begin with, can you kind of walk us through where and when this image was taken and kind of how you came upon this moment?
Yeah, my favorite style of birding is by kayak in the morning, which brings several advantages. So this was, dawn or very shortly after dawn on a kind of a steamy early summer, late spring day, which was creating the fog off the cool water. This photo was actually pretty beginner level when I took it, and I was using my older camera. This was a Canon 70D, kind of a 2015-ish era Canon. The flyby of the heron was luck. I certainly didn't know that the heron was going to fly by me within 15 or 20 feet, but the image was a result of having used my camera settings adjusted to the environment. So I was focused on the shoreline in the distance and the fog and exposed to the right light. And I love this picture for a couple of reasons, particularly the way that the wing is just off the water as the bird flew by. Obviously, it's partly a silhouette, but you get some nice detail in the wing. And I love how you can see the light shining through the beak, actually. It's a really cool detail of that one.
Yeah, right in that one little spot, like right at the top of the beak.
Yeah, and you don't always get to pick your background, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later, that the background is really important for all birding images, but particularly birds in flight can really add to the artistic creation.
So I have one other question for you. Did you underexpose this photo manually, or was this just the nature of the sunrise fog of the environment?
I wasn't intentionally underexposing the bird, but I was exposing to the background, which is a little bit opposite of what I'm going to tell you later.
Okay.
But you can notice the fog and the sort of the lake was the scene I was adjusted to. The bird came through, and you're right, it's a little bit underexposed, but that's what creates the artistry of this image, and it creates a nice contrast. It's sort of like low-key contrast between the dark bird and the light fog and stuff. And it was also kind of lucky that the background lined up really nicely with the line of the fog in the background.
So we've got 2 eagle photos we're going to show. This is the first one. And these images are really packed with a lot of action. So what I'm curious about is how do you plan or anticipate a moment like this?
You certainly can't always anticipate a moment like this, but you have to know your environment and the scene that could present itself. So notice in this photo, and I'm glad that you picked this one because I don't think it's the greatest artistic photo, but I love that you love it anyway.
Well, look at his feet. There's so much, you can see the power in this animal right in this shot.
Agreed. And so this was sort of March when the ice was melting off the lake and there were some dead fish that were kind of melting out of the ice. And knowing that those are good conditions is what made this scene possible. So on this day, you and I went for a walk down the street, and I brought my camera just because I knew it was a good time to maybe see bald eagles up in the sky. They like the ice edges when the ice is melting away. They like to forage out of the ice because they're really bad hunters, right? This is a good image that sort of is what you might think of an eagle grabbing a fish out of the water, but they kind of suck at hunting that way. They'll steal a fish from an osprey or from another eagle or something. They certainly can catch a fish from the water, like if you're at a really target-rich location like Conowingo Dam or something like that, which is a photography hotspot. But most of the time, they're happy to scavenge trash or roadkill or a frozen fish coming up out of the ice like this. But it's also a good image for a couple of reasons. We can see it's a little bit grainy. I had my ISO set really high. In this case, It was up at about ISO 1000, which on a lot of modern cameras would not be a problem at all. But on my Canon 70D, you can see it introduced quite a bit of grain here based off of my other settings. I also was probably a little too fast on the shutter speed here. It was 1/3200th of a second, which probably isn't necessary for a large bird like this. And I was fully maxed out at my 400 millimeter zoom. But it also highlights that bald eagles are notoriously difficult to photograph because your camera is always hunting for what's called middle gray in an image. And middle gray on a bird that's nearly black and white makes a scene like this where like the wing feather detail is lost, the wing is really dark, and the head is a little bit overblown. It's sort of too bright. The camera struggled for either of those targets because it was right in the center, but it made for a good action situation, if not a perfect image. But I do really like the image that resulted.
All right. And so now here's our second image of him trying to fly away with his fish, and it looks like it just dropped. Did he end up getting it?
He did. We had a couple minutes with this bird. He picked up the fish and kind of dropped it and went after it again. This one, unlike the last picture, shows a lot of really great feather detail, even though the face is still overexposed a little bit. But it's really nice in that you get a much better shot of the fish, and you can sort of tell that the fish like escaped its talons or something like that and has fallen, so it creates an extra bit of drama to the image. And again, it lines up nicely with the horizon in the background to see the eagle against the ice, rather than competing with the trees and stuff like that.
Okay. So I have a photography question too. I just got distracted worrying about whether or not this guy got his dinner in the end or not. But so were you shooting in burst mode or like single frame? Like what was going on from a setting standpoint?
Yeah, pretty sure I definitely was in burst mode, which is, for you new photographers, holding down the shutter button so it goes tick, 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 and catches as many pictures as you can. On that camera, I think it was only 3 or 4 frames per second, which is fine, but my new camera makes 15 frames per second by comparison. So that kind of is probably why I ended up, with more pictures of the fish falling than I did with it in the talons in this case.
Okay, so you've taken a lot of nest box photos over the years. This is like another one of my all-time favorite moments. In fact, I moved our screen so that it wouldn't be in the way of this amazing daddy who's coming to feed his babies. What's the trick to capturing moments so like precisely like this?
Yeah, well, this one obviously is the preparation of having the box and creating the habitat and stuff. It's the long game of bird conservation so that you have opportunities like this. And then knowing the schedule and what was going on in the box to know, when stuff was going to happen. But then in the shorter term, around when this image was taken, I obviously was able to observe multiple feeding instances and chances to practice. This photo includes the hand of man, because obviously that's not a natural nest cavity. But it creates a lot of visual interest because you've got the subject is the dad bluebird with a bug in its beak, bringing food to the baby, and you can really see both the dad's eyes locked in on the target as well as the baby watching the dad come in. So there's a lot of stuff to look at in an image like this. And one like this gives you an opportunity to hone the settings for your camera. You get multiple opportunities like this. I mentioned before that I had shot that eagle too fast at 1/3200th of a second, way too fast for a slow moving bald eagle, which is what created that high ISO in the grain in the earlier image. This one is 1/1000th of a second, which is about the slowest you would want for a small bird in flight. So I had probably worked my way down to figure out that that's the right spot because it froze the bird's body and its head, but left just enough of the wing blur to create that action. I was also at 400 millimeters, so kind of in my yard, but 30 or 40 feet away, wide open at 5.6 f-stop on my camera. And I'm pretty sure I was using ISO auto, which came out to be at ISO 1000, which is interesting because this is the same ISO 1000 that we had seen for the bald eagle before, but there's no grain in this picture at all because the other settings were more honed in.
And then we have this photo, which I always think is really fun. He looks like a little torpedo coming out of the nest as well. It's incredible. It's like so precise of a shot of him flying. What are your comments on this one?
Yeah, this one also is burst mode. This was the newer camera, my Canon R7. So this one captures about 15 frames per second, depending on the settings. They were about the same in terms of shutter speed and stuff as the last one, but this one lines up really nicely. Instead of having the wings kind of open and showing the action, it's just the wing tips, and the fact that they're in line with the body gives it that torpedo look. I don't recall if it was the same burst mode that I saw the dad fly in and fly out with, but it could have been the exact same sequence with the same settings, although I can see from the metadata of this photo that the ISO is a little higher at 1250. Actually, the background is a little bit different as well, so I do think it's probably a separate instance of this feeding action. So it's another one where it's a real obvious target, not as much eye movement taking you from one subject to another, but it still has that hand of man, which is okay, but I don't love it. But it does tell the story that there was, some nest box action going on, which is kind of my thing.
I think it's interesting because I know you don't love the hand of man, but the thing for me is this is conservation work in action. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is kind of an importance to showing these nest boxes, right?
It's absolutely part of the story. It's just the type of thing that wouldn't win any prizes at a photography salon. So
now we're moving on to Mama Bird. We finally are seeing her, and she's been doing some house cleaning, it looks like. So yeah, what do you want to tell us about this picture?
So this one I think is a little bit better artistically because there is no hand of man, or actually there's a little bit. Do you see it?
No.
I've cropped it out, but I believe this mama bird was taking off from the top of our fence, and you can just see that straight line of the fence post under her one claw.
Oh, yeah.
But you could easily crop that out and remove it. But the claw, I think, tells a little bit of a story, and without any more, you can't tell if that's a branch or anything else. But I love this one because it's a pure bird in flight. It's got a really nice bouquet, the soft background in the distance. Oftentimes, good bird photography starts by choosing your background, or at least selecting a background that's kind of off in the distance. And by using a tight f-stop, in this case it's 5.6 again, which is the maximum for my lens at that focal length of 400 millimeters, it really does a good job of blurring out those green tree leaves in the background and bringing the subject into focus. And, the male bluebirds get all the attention, but this female is really striking too. And of course, any bird with a bug in its mouth on its way to the nest box tells its own story.
Well, I don't think that's a bug in her mouth, though.
Oh, that's a good point. I think it was a fecal sac.
So gross. So gross. But figures. Mom's doing the job, cleaning the house. Like, she's a good mama.
That's right. For those of you that don't know, bluebirds and many birds don't soil their nest. Those baby birds hold their butt up in the air and kind of present a little sack of their poop to the mom or dad, who grab it and fly it away from the nest and drop it. So bluebird nests are nice and clean even after those babies fledge. Mm-hmm. And this is the mom taking away one of those fecal sacs.
It's a dirty job sometimes, isn't it, moms and dads? But she's doing her thing. All right. So what amazes me about this next picture, moving on from bluebirds to tree swallows, is that they're so fast. They're so little acrobats, just fluttering around. I have never, ever managed to get a picture of a tree swallow. So how did you even see this moment to be able to photograph it? These birds are lined up perfectly.
Well, the good part is out in nature when they're feeding, they're coming every 3 to 5 minutes. So I probably didn't just see this and spur of the moment and take the photo, but rather, again, was out in the kayak. This was midday. I remember taking a little paddle for my lunch break with my camera because I knew that there was some active snags out in the swamp where I could get a photo like this. And so I'm sure I watched them come back and forth several times, used those opportunities to make sure I was lined up well. So I had kind of the sun at my back. So I was able to properly expose both the tree snag as well as the proper focal depth to get the birds within, a couple feet of that snag in focus, but also have that nice bouquet in the background with the leaves and the branches back there, not too distracting because they're kind of blurred out. And again, the eye and the focus of the parent, as well as the obvious begging and gaping from the baby tree swallow, really kind of tells its own story. But I had plenty of opportunity to line that up, use burst mode or beast mode, if you want to call it that, in order to, practice and get this photo just right. And I'm sure I had, 50 or 100 more different frames of this and really picked the best one. Also, one last thing, I love that this one does not have any hand of man at all. So it's a purely natural thing. I didn't even curate the nest in this case. I just showed up in the swamp and photographed it.
I've noticed in a couple of the images we've gone through, this one included, you've talked a lot about prepping for your shot or prepping your site. What does that mean?
Yeah, you don't always get to choose your background or your lighting, but if you have the opportunity to choose a background and wait for the bird to come into that can often make a really compelling shot. In this case, I more or less was able to set up my lighting with the sun at my back. It turned out that this was sort of a head-on shot of the nest hole, but I could have gone up to 90 degrees to the right or left to pick different angles. This one happened to work out nicely. The background wasn't too much of a consideration, but having multiple opportunities to hone in on my settings. In situations like this, I like to use my shutter priority setting, meaning I knew I needed something fast. This was probably 1500 to 2000, 1/1500th to 1/2000th of a second. I don't have the metadata, but I knew I needed it to be fast, and the bokeh in the background and the ISO were secondary. But those are also good settings that a new photographer can use to let your input define the critical factor. In this case, it's the speed of the shutter, and then let the camera determine the other things. And then if you have some time to practice an image like this, like I had with multiple opportunities, then you can start to hone in on what the right combination is in that golden triangle, and then move over to manual mode if you want to finally adjust it. Which is what I often do when I have lots of different opportunities. I like to, if I have a subject, try to shoot it with multiple different combinations of stuff, because it gets you some more artistic outputs when you do that too.
And now for the best image of them all, I will say out of all the photography Dustin's done, this is my absolute favorite shot of his that he's ever taken. It's just absolutely beautiful. It looks almost like an oil painting. We've always had great blue herons on our lake. I have like a very soft spot in my heart for them because we see them sometimes hanging out on our dock and stuff. Do you remember how you felt like when you reviewed this image and realized what you had captured here?
I do remember. The story behind this one is interesting. It looks like it's nighttime or something, but I promise you it was literally in the minutes right after technical sunrise, but probably about 15 minutes after sunrise when the sun here comes up above the trees and hits the lake for the first time. So I had just paddled off of our dock not more than 100 yards or so, leaving around sunrise, and came upon this great blue heron who was standing, probably having spent the whole night on the mud flat on the right-hand side of our lake. And I know that they often will stay there until just a few minutes after sunrise. When the sun hits them and they start to warm up, they'll either move to a new location because they want to rest somewhere else in the shade, or it's time to get out hunting. So I had actually stopped in the kayak and spent 5 or 10 minutes kind of at a distance watching this bird and playing with different camera settings. So I was partly using the background trees, but I knew that one of the best pieces of advice I'd ever been given was to create artistic photography. Don't worry about exposing for the entire scene. Focus on exposing for your subject. So I was really keen on picking up the white, but not overexposing the white on the heron's face, and getting the bird well exposed. What I didn't expect was for it to take off when it did, but I was prepared and I had the right settings dialed in. And so as I clicked off a few of these pictures, I thought I probably had a little more of the like green and water background and kind of the reflection, but it had moved from the lighting that was in across into a little bit more of a different lighting situation. And so the exposure that I had pre-dialed in wasn't exactly right, but it really paid off because I was perfectly exposed for my subject, and it made for a really dramatic image because the background was underexposed, but not totally. So if you look closely, of course, you can see the ripples behind the bird, but above and below the bird, you can actually see the trees in the distance on the far shoreline and the reflection of those trees. So you do get a little sense of that environment while retaining the high contrast between the bird and the dark background.
Yeah, they're like these like vertical like stripes that you can see almost coming down on the back of the image.
And after the bird flew away and I took a moment to look down at the LED screen on the back of my camera, it took my breath away because I knew I had taken a really special photograph. If I have any regret about this one at all, it's just that there's not enough space in front of the bird. I'd like to have had a little more canvas out there, which I could do, digitally, but I'm a purist that way.
And so to confirm, this was early light. Did you adjust the exposure to make the background drop away?
Yeah, I didn't though. I was really focused on just getting the exposure right for the bird. So this was 1/500th of a second, which is about right for a large bird in flight. And I can see the ISO was very low, ISO 160. So it was actually in pretty bright light, but it was exposed well with the shadows in the background to be able to capture it this way.
Okay, so for folks who want to try bird in flight photography, or birders who are trying to improve in that area, when they're out with their cameras, where should they start?
Well, start humble because bird photography, and especially bird in flight photography, is the deep end of the pool. So some birders are pure birders and non-photographers, and then they want to grab a camera and start with bird photography. That's what I did. It's just the hard way to do it. The other path is that photographers start and they gradually want more and more challenging photography, and they work their way up to birds. A lot of them are pure photographers and not pure birders. And they're great too. There's no one perfect way to do it, but exist in the space that makes you happy, right? If you just want basic photographs to ID birds, great. If you want to get more and more advanced, great. In my case, it was more of a personal challenge to take a better picture of a bird than I'd ever taken of it before, or take a picture of a species that I'd never seen before. So whatever it is that, cranks your gears, live in that space most of all. But tips for bird in flight photography specifically is get familiar with your camera and the shutter speeds you need for different birds, because large birds move really slowly. You can shoot at a much longer shutter speed to get greater detail for a bird like the great blue heron that we saw in the bald eagles. But smaller birds, you need to be at least 1/1200th or maybe even 1/2000th for your shutter speed. So get familiar with that kind of stuff and know that if you're shooting, a hummingbird, you need to be really high. And if you're shooting a warbler, maybe just a little bit lower. If it's a robin or a scarlet tanager or something like that, know the range for that stuff. And then nextly, backgrounds are really important, right? Avoid backgrounds with hand of man all over them. Don't hesitate to set up your scene a little bit. If you have a good feeder station, put, an elevated log behind it that birds will take to as a good place to rest before they go to the feeder, because you can get a much better photograph from that log that has no hand of man in it than from on the feeder, that kind of stuff. But also practice your autofocus tracking from your camera. Know your camera's settings, because, out of the box, your camera might focus just on the center square. But if you put it in, say, wildlife mode or autofocus tracking, that center square will move with the bird it's detecting around your screen and help you stay on it. And then lastly, right, try to line up a shot that has something either interesting in the background or that has the background off in the distance, because then you're going to get that nice bouquet that pulls the bird out in front of you. And sometimes a bird just up in the sky can be a great picture with really fine detail for the bird. It's just not artistically interesting because there's nothing but blue in the background or things like that. And if you don't have those opportunities, be ready for when the bird does something unexpected, like this picture of a gull that came through with a large shell in its mouth. In any case, I forget what kind it is. But those sorts of things give you a photo with a lot more interest than just a bird on a blue background.
Yeah, I love that picture of that gull. He's absolutely hilarious. Anything else you want to mention to viewers before we close out this topic for the week?
I would just say, like I said, live in the place that gets you fired up. If you like taking pictures of birds at the feeder, great. If you like taking pictures just of nest boxes or focusing on shorebirds or warblers, great. Live in that space, whatever makes you happy, because there's all different flavors of birding and photography. And those things change over time. So you're going to have different eras of what you like to do. Whatever era is, getting you going today, live in that place and enjoy it. And a question for our listeners. If you've ever tried photographing birds in flight, what's been the biggest challenge for you? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear what you're struggling with so we can talk more about it in a future episode.